Thank you for coming to our online talk. This is Reaction Politics Research Network's first online book talk of the year, but also it's our first online book talk ever. But hopefully, if there's interest, we will be having a lot more in the coming year. My name is Uygar Baspehlivan. I am a research associate at the University of Bristol, and I will be your host and chair today. If it's your first event with us, just to let you know that Reactionary Politics Research Network is a nascent interdisciplinary project found at the University of Bath that seeks to bring together and facilitate collaborations among critical scholars who study and work to counter the insidious surge of reactionary politics around the world. We organize workshops, training events, summer schools, and other collaborative activities to create what we hope to be a truly critical, intersectional, and interdisciplinary space around reactionary politics research. If you're interested in learning more about the network, please feel free to visit our website at reactpol.net, join our mailing list, and follow us on our socials at reactpol.ran. Today, we're very excited to welcome Dr. Jordan Carroll with us to talk about his recently released book, Speculative Whiteness, Science Fiction and the Alt-Right, which was published by the University of Minnesota Press as part of their Forerunner series a couple of months ago. In addition to the book that you will be hearing about today, he's also the author of Reading the Obscene, Transgressive Editors and the Class Politics of U.S. Literature, which was published by Stanford University Press in 2021. And Jordan received his PhD in English literature from the University of California, Davis. And in addition to receiving the David G. Hartwell Emerging Scholar Award by the International Association for the Fantastic in the Arts, he won the MLA Prize for Independent Scholars for his first book. His writing has also appeared in American Literature, the Journal of the Fantastic in the Arts, and The Nation. Before welcoming Jordan, I want to let everyone know that this event is recorded and it will be uploaded to YouTube. So if you would, don't want to show your face, or if you're worried about asking a question, it's important that you know that the event will be recorded. Just to give a general sort of timeline for the talk, Jordan will be giving us a summary of his main arguments of the book for about 40 minutes, I believe, a bit more, a bit less. And then Jordan and I will have a short discussion. From afterwards, we will open the virtual floor for questions from you all. So without further ado, Jordan, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for agreeing to come and give us a talk about this brilliant book. I read it, I love it. So yeah, here you go. Floor is yours.
So thank you all so much for having me. I'd like to thank the Reactionary Politics Research Network, as well as everybody in the audience for coming out. So yeah, today I'd like to talk first about the argument of the book before thinking a little bit about how things have evolved even in the months since I finished writing the manuscript. But first, before we do that, I think we should acknowledge that today is Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Dr. King embodies everything that the alt-right opposes. We, of course, know his invaluable work in the struggle for civil rights and racial equality, but many may not realize that Dr. King was also a fan of speculative narratives. When Coretta Scott King loaned him a copy of Edward Bellamy's utopian novel, Looking Backward, 2000 to 1887, he praised its vision of a post-capitalist future and called its author a social prophet. Indeed, he saw science fiction as crucial to the fight against racism. Nichelle Nichols, who played Lieutenant Uhura in Star Trek, the original series, once told Dr. King that she was thinking about leaving the television show after the first season. He insisted that she stay on the show to keep playing her part. Dr. King told her that Star Trek was the only program that he and his wife allowed their children to stay up late to watch. He furthermore suggested that a Black woman on the bridge of the Starship Enterprise was crucial to showing that Black people could fulfill any role pursue any profession, and even go into space. Dr. King is also important for this presentation because of his own speculative imagination, his own capacity for utopian dreaming. White nationalists claim that only white men are capable of imagining an alternative future. Dr. King's life's work is proof positive that the fascists are wrong. I'd also like to give a few warnings and caveats before I start. First, a warning. There's no way to discuss this topic without bringing up upsetting images and ideas. I'll be discussing racism, sexism, violence, and genocide. And now for a caveat. I'm an Americanist in my training, and although I touch on fascists from around the globe, a lot of what I have to say today is about the US context. And the present conjuncture, what's going on today, makes it especially difficult to avoid directing many of my comments toward the immediate fate of the US. So apologies in advance if at moments I succumb to my provincialism. And also I should say, I've only heard bits and pieces of the current inaugural speech that happened today. So I might be in the dark on some things. This is a quickly evolving topic of research, I think, unfortunately. We often consider the far right to be backward looking. White nationalists appear as nostalgic and retrograde. They desire to drag us back into the past, pulling us towards an imagined era of unquestioned hierarchy that was supposedly characterized by stability and order. Obviously, this is one of the major narratives of the right. Think, for example, of Make America Great Again. We see this in the alt-right and white nationalism more broadly as well. Some white nationalists want to return to their distorted visions of Greek antiquity, pagan Europe, medieval Christendom, or America at some point prior to the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965. Return has even become a meme. There are online traditionalists who claim to long for the golden years of 1990s consumer culture. Many scholars, especially medievalists and classicists, have done important work tracking and debunking these historical myths. However, our understanding of the far right as a political impulse to return to the past sometimes obscures the movement's long-standing orientation towards futurity. Interwar fascism saw itself as forward-thinking. Scholars of these movements have detailed Italian fascism's connections with the futurists, as well as the Nazi Party's deep ties to an engineering culture deeply invested in the project of modernization. Roger Griffin describes a quote-unquote sense of a beginning in European fascism. They saw themselves as standing on the threshold of a new era, one in which they hoped to root techno-scientific modernity in the primordial nature of blood and soil. Fascism presented itself as a destiny, a Reich that would last 1,000 years. We see a similar kind of technological optimism in post-war fascisms. Hindu nationalism lays claim to ancient Vedic sciences, far more advanced than anything we know now, while the French New Right fantasizes about so-called archaeo-futurist scenarios where European peasant folkways coexist with astounding technological inventions. In the US, this fascist futurity has often been bound up with science fiction. I have found in my research that the most important figures in late 20th century white nationalism, including Willis Carto, William Luther Pierce, and David Duke, all engaged in speculative fantasies about space colonization and other futuristic marvels. The first major neo-Nazi organization in the United States, the National Renaissance Party, was governed by James H. Madol, an avid science fiction reader who was radicalized by a speculative author. He tried to recruit followers from fandom as well as from occult circles. Madol imagined that after the ethnic cleansing of the United States, indeed perhaps the world, the nation would be transformed into a new Atlantis ruled by the kind of technocratic elite frequently found in mid-century pulps. The alt-right the alt-right is just as fascinated by science fiction and other forms of speculation. Richard Spencer devotes many of his podcasts to analyzing science fiction films and books. Although Spencer models his public image after clean-cut fascists like George Lincoln Rockwell, he can be heard on shows bragging about owning a lightsaber, obsessing over Christopher Nolan films, and discussing the Dune franchise with intense interest. In recent years, Spencer has even run an online course dedicated to science fiction cinema. Other alt-right promoters include Matthew Heimbach and Jason Reza Georgiani, and they've proven equally interested in speculative genres. The alt-right considers science fiction to be so important because the movement follows Andrew Breitbart in maintaining that, quote, politics is downstream from culture, end quote. Alt-right figures such as Spencer have borrowed the concept of metapolitics from the reactionary Gramscians of the French New Right. They believe that the only way to dismantle liberal hegemony is to undermine its pre-political assumptions through cultural counter-messaging. The alt-right frames debates over Star Trek and Star Wars as battles in an ongoing culture war to further the interests of the white race. Policy changes will follow, they claim, once they have prepared the white population by introducing them to fascist attitudes through popular media or interpretation of popular media. These ideas also reflect the influence of British fascist Jonathan Bowden, who believed that mass cultural forms such as science fiction novels, fantasy epics, and superhero comics contain subtexts that contradict egalitarianism's official dogma. According to Bowden, speculative narratives often feature sovereign heroes who smash their subhuman foes in acts of extra-legal violence. So here we might think of Carl Schmitt. To avoid any appearance of totalitarianism, Bowden argues, these narratives displace the fascist impulse toward world domination onto the villain, who the audience openly reviles but secretly admires. These are ideas that most liberal audiences would find abhorrent were they not presented in fantastical scenarios. Many alt-right intellectuals therefore spend an inordinate amount of time mining popular culture for traces of a submerged fascist tendency that they hope to surface. But I want to argue that science fiction represents more than a form of cultural subversion for the far right. My book's central claim is that white nationalists have long believed that the future belongs to them. The far right maintains that only white men have the ability to imagine the future. In this myth, white men possess a racially unique capacity for speculation, including rational planning, counterfactual imagination, and inspired innovation. At the same time, the far right claims that only white men can realize this future. This ideology holds that whiteness is a potential for greatness, including the inborn ability to build a high-tech utopia. One component of this myth system is that only white elites will inhabit the futures promised by science fiction. White nationalists believe that non-white people represent the dead hand of history holding back a techno-fascist utopia. After the genocide, they claim, the white world will forge ahead with endless discoveries and innovations ranging from space colonization to genetic manipulation. Conversely, many far-right thinkers believe that a multicultural and multiracial world will inevitably slide first into stagnation, then into a primitive state characterized by scarcity and violence. In this exterminationist fantasy, there's no future for a world that isn't all white. Many white nationalists also maintain that only white people are capable of imagining anything beyond the present. We could break this myth down into several different elements. The first myth theme is that only white people have the self-control to plan for the future. The second is that white people are uniquely imaginative or visionary. And the third is that white people are alone in their willingness to make extreme risks or sacrifices to implement their visions. We can find the roots of each of these misconceptions in white supremacist thought of the 18th and 19th centuries. First of all, we're told that white people possess a capacity for self-discipline that allows them to approach long-term decision-making with the appropriate forethought. White people are said to be born capitalists, saving and investing in their future prosperity instead of consuming everything in the present. They pass the marshmallow test, essentially. On the other hand, non-white people have often been depicted as impulsive or wasteful, incapable of planning for the future. In an often repeated just so story, white people became naturally provident because they evolved under Arctic conditions that required them to store food for the next winter. Needless to say, anthropologists have refuted this so-called cold winters hypothesis many times over. Some white nationalists go so far as to suggest that white people own science fiction as a genre. For example, the blogger Vox Day, I should say, made it quite clear that he did not think people of color, such as N.K. Jemisin, belonged in the genre. In his explanation, he stated that white people are more quote unquote civilized than other races because they have low time preferences, which is to say they're willing to sacrifice a low payout today for a higher payout tomorrow. White people are therefore genetically pre-programmed to be future-oriented. He would later make a failed bid to sweep the Hugo Awards, an annual literary award for the best science fiction and fantasy works. In addition to denying white people the future, white nationalists go as far as to assert that non-white people cannot conceptualize any alternatives to what already exists or existed. White people are said to be especially imaginative, even otherworldly in their capacity for dreaming up other realities. On the other hand, one especially hateful alt-right meme claims that Black people cannot understand alternative histories or counterfactual scenarios. Needless to say, authors of color continue to show up white nationalists by creating amazing works in all speculative genres. In response, alt-right protests have only grown increasingly insulting and shrill. On today of all days, it's worth noting as well that these fantasies of white futurity are as elitist and anti-democratic as they are racist. According to the far right, the future is made by the select few, those who plan ahead, and these future visionaries must always contend with the short-sightedness of the masses who just want welfare handouts and other forms of instant gratification in their estimation. In the most extreme far-right fantasies, they split humanity into two species. They identify themselves as post-human mutants who represent the next step in human evolution, and they brand the rest of humanity as evolutionary throwbacks to a pre-human past. Democratic deliberation is impossible when speaking across such vast gulfs of evolutionary time. Politics is reframed as Darwinian competition between alien species, and dialogue gives way to plans for domination, deportation, and ultimately elimination of the enemy faction. Let us now turn to the third component of the myth of white futurity, which is the idea that white people are especially suited for entrepreneurial risk. Spencer is perhaps most emphatic about this idea that white people are able to bring about grand designs due to their willingness to engage in acts of creative destruction or even self-destruction. These notions are clearly callbacks to the romantic fantasies of glorious death dreamed by interwar fascism. Fascists cast liberals as Nietzschean last men, self-satisfied and materialistic figures, concerned with their own mere survival and the maintenance of the current system as it exists. Here there's an overtone of anti-Semitism and misogyny. Material comforts are coded as effeminate, while materialism itself is coded as Jewish. Meanwhile, fascists style themselves as Übermenschen. They see themselves as idealists capable of making a violent rupture with the present in order to realize an unforeseeable future that cannot be predicted through rational means. Spencer and his fellow podcasters marvel at Paul Atreides' willingness to blow up the entire spice economy, risking his own life and livelihood to rise to galactic power in Frank Herbert's Dune. Fascists assert that white elites are able to do this because they hold contempt for the actual or material, including their own lives, which they're willing to sacrifice for the potential or the ideal. This notion of racial potential is important. The far right does not see whiteness as a trait that manifests in the actual present. Instead, whiteness appears as a destiny that is waiting to be completed in the techno-fascist future. We are told that even the most mediocre white man is a would-be explorer who is being held back from reaching the stars by his racial enemies who want to reduce him to a state of emasculated consumerism and finally racial suicide. In this delusion, space exploration is simply a manifestation of white people's innate settler colonial spirit, which includes an instinctive desire to explore, conquer, and expand into new spaces. Here is worth noting that space is especially appealing to fascists because it is a Lebensraum free of non-white indigenous populations who could potentially intermix with the white space colonizers. It's very convenient that white nationalists complain of being prevented from living up to their full potentials. White nationalists always seem to borrow light from greater figures than themselves, taking credit for the Greeks and the Romans, the scientists and cathedral builders of European history. But they often seem to be men of modest accomplishments at best. But if whiteness is a promissory note that is yet to be fulfilled, then white nationalists can compensate for their failures by imagining the greatness they could have achieved were it not for the conspiracy holding them down. Which leads us to the reason why these ideas catch on among some disgruntled white men. Describing the far right's ideas is important, but we must also consider the material basis for their success. I would argue that the right in general is a cross-class coalition of the entitled and the disappointed. It is not composed of the wretched of the earth, but it is made up of people who perceive a gap between the social position they inhabit and the more elevated position they believe they were promised in the social hierarchy. This includes downwardly mobile people who are genuinely impoverished or indebted, but also local elites who think they're entitled to a bigger presence on the national stage. And now it increasingly includes billionaires who think that the economy should be growing at a faster rate. What unites these people together is their belief that radical subversives and racialized outsiders have robbed them of a better future. They may be relatively comfortable compared to the rest of the world, but they look at the trend line projected by their parents' upward mobility or the booming fortunes of the mid-century economy, and then they see that the actual performance in more recent decades has fallen quite short. Science fiction becomes a way for the far right to talk about that lost possibility. Peter Thiel wonders why he doesn't have a flying car. The right has varying solutions to the case of the missing future. Trumpists seem to think a strong nation backed by a tough leader with hardened borders will take us back to the future, to quote Elon Musk's campaign advertisement. The far right, however, goes even further to suggest that the future promised in the 1950s is only possible with an all-white racial stock. In actuality, all of these revanchist fantasies misrecognize what is really going on, namely the crisis of capitalism, including its ongoing stagnation since 1973. Speculative whiteness proves to be a stumbling block to an effective politics that would address our current moment. But it also proves to be an impediment to critical science fiction. The science fiction that many of us value asks us to think historically. How would we be different if we inhabited a radically changed world with different societal structures, different technologies, and different cultural presuppositions? But the alt-right cannot imagine change. White identity will always stay the same for them. They say that the potential to build spaceships and skyscrapers already existed in white people 1,000 years ago. The only difference is that at some point this potential was actualized. In this view, past and future historical development is little more than the changing expression of a white spirit or white genome that itself remains static. According to Spencer's Nietzschean slogan, White people are simply becoming who they are. We could talk about other deficiencies in alt-right science fiction thinking, but this is a major one. They talk a lot about revolutionary new futures, but they cannot imagine anything beyond their own eternal identity. And that is essentially the argument of the book. Throughout the book, I look at a wide variety of figures from the history of both science fiction and white nationalism, who all suggest that the future is white people's racial legacy. The book then moves towards the alt-right as what was then the latest and most insistent articulation of this idea. However, as I worked on this project, it became clear that the alt-right was but a phase in a longer history of white nationalist and fascist movements. The political fortunes of many of the alt-right's central protagonists fell after Charlottesville in 2017. Most of the figures who remained prominent in the national consciousness were members of the alt-light, reactionaries who publicly swore off anti-Semitism and white separatism, even as they embraced xenophobia and cultural chauvinism. Perhaps more importantly, the gestures that set the alt-right apart from previous far-right movements seemed to become unfashionable, even among those squarely within the movement. The alt-right's attempts to create a more media-friendly and intellectualized version of white nationalism failed to convince either the public or its far-right base for obvious reasons. Antifa denied the alt-right the streets. Trump absorbed the alt-right's energies. Infighting overtook coalition building. And many white nationalists chose mass shootings over media optics as their preferred mechanism for social change. The alt-right seems to be a vanishing mediator, taking some reactionaries on a journey towards something like a reboot of the white power movement of the post-Vietnam War period, and taking others towards a hardline nativist and anti-democratic form of national conservatism, no longer interested in appealing to anyone outside of an elite base. We still use the term alt-right, but the referent seems different now. Maybe. I don't pretend to be sure. Elon Musk is sporting a Pepe avatar these days, so maybe the alt-right is making a comeback. November perhaps has changed more than we think, including not only our future prospects, but also our interpretation of the recent past. So now we enter into speculative territory, and I'd be happy to hear alternative views on the mess that we're in. But for now, let's trace a few of the heirs to the alt-right speculative whiteness, which seem to have mutated rather than disappeared in roughly the past half-decade. The biggest change in speculative whiteness has been its transition into something like speculative elitism or speculative eugenics. Obviously, whiteness as a social construct has always been very flexible in terms of both its membership and meaning. But now we're seeing the ideas incorporated in speculative whiteness applied to social groupings that are even vaguer and fuzzier than Gentile men of European descent. Conspiracism substitutes for whiteness the category of red-blooded American patriots. Silicon Valley reactionaries, on the other hand, tend to believe that the future will be brought about by productive, high IQ individuals in technical fields, regardless of their national origin. Both of these categories overlap with whiteness, sometimes entirely, but they often extend to select members of other racial formations in a way that outright neo-Nazis find objectionable. I will touch on conspiracism briefly, given the seeming relative importance of Silicon Valley reactionaries as of this particular date. One can find a clip of Alex Jones hailing his listeners as would-be Magellans. He claims that his followers were destined to explore the stars, but that future has been cannibalized by the globalists. Similar notions pervade QAnon, which maintains, to borrow a line from William Gibson, that the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. The liberal elites of Hollywood, Washington, and Davos keep all the futuristic technologies we were promised hidden in underground tunnels. We learn, for example, that the globalists use secret regenerative methods to remain forever healthy and useful, while the rest of us tragically keep getting older. According to this conspiracy, the globalists are vampirizing the youthful potential of red-blooded American patriots, hoarding all of that vitality and possibility for themselves. Children always represent our future. And so in the latest rendition of the anti-Semitic blood libel myth, we learn that globalists sacrifice children in occult ceremonies in order to extract from them adrenochrome, an ecstatic drug and an elixir of life. All of this serves as a compensatory mechanism for individuals who are promised greatness first by America and then by Trump, but never saw it. If someone has stolen their youth and their hopes from them, these can be returned by rough justice, clandestine trials, and public executions. The Silicon Valley reactionaries represent a somewhat different dream of loss and renewal. As the late David Columbia pointed out, the new cyber libertarians cleave to an ideology of producerism. Their purported heroes are the hardworking, productive technicians and entrepreneurs with high IQs who innovate and generate value for the market. On the other hand, their villains are unproductive parasites at both the top and bottom of the social scale. These include government bureaucrats, HR professionals, DEI hires, woke liberal influencers, and welfare recipients. It's the makers versus the takers all over again. Unproductive parasites supposedly stifle innovation by over-regulating tech entrepreneurs or forcing them to degrade the efficiency of their companies through counterproductive measures such as diversity quotas or DEI training. As a result, the parasites forestall the acceleration of technological and economic progress that only tech entrepreneurs can achieve. It may sound like they're just ringing the changes on Ayn Rand, but they've introduced a few science fictional elements. Elon Musk has adopted the mantle of rational planner, looking out into a future that we lesser mortals are unable to predict in order to see a universe populated by untold trillions of smart, productive citizens. Musk is a superficial reader of science fiction, but nevertheless, he borrows from science fiction texts such as Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy and Robert A. Heinlein's The Moon is a Harsh Mistress to flesh out this vision. In Asimov, a brilliant scientific mind guides the course of future history away from prolonged catastrophe through his projections. In Heinlein, we meet a band of smart individuals guided by a supercomputer whose probabilistic calculations allow them to stage manage a libertarian revolution. The lesson he takes from each of them is that history is made by the smart few rather than the blundering masses. Musk marries this elitist vision to a eugenic ideology that stresses the need to maximize the reproduction rates for intelligent individuals to stave off what he sees as the coming idiocracy. Space exploration is therefore important to him, not only because it provides insurance for existential risks, but also because it allows him to imagine the exponential growth of genetically gifted populations unbounded by earthly constraints. But of course, this vision of the future is only possible if people like Musk are not constrained by the masses, who appear in this scenario as zombified dupes infected by the woke mind virus. Peter Thiel presents a darker prophecy than Musk, but one that complements rather than contradicts Musk's prescription for eugenic meritocracy. If Musk is the rational planner, Thiel is the inspired risk taker. Thiel draws as much from eschatology as from science fiction. He argues that history veers between two inevitable poles, Armageddon and the Antichrist. Armageddon represents the risk of technological self-destruction, while the Antichrist represents a global state that stifles freedom and innovation in its quest to protect humanity from Armageddon. According to Thiel, progress outside of the computing fields has slowed in recent decades due to a failure of nerve in the face of dangerous new inventions such as the atomic bomb. Thiel claims that progress has stalled out because people have become too risk-averse, too worried about unleashing the immense technological forces that are within our capabilities. It's significant that Thiel is perhaps best known these days for Palantir, a data surveillance company named after the Seeing Stones in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings trilogy. These magical artifacts are double-edged. They allow the user to spy on others, but they also draw the evil eye of Sauron, a fact that leads to the corruption and downfall of Saruman the White Wizard. Lord of the Rings is a warning about the fatal ambiguity of powerful technologies. And Teal seems to have responded by saying that he is strong enough to wear the One Ring while resisting its temptation toward evil. He's basically Boromir, but better. Teal wants us to man up and wield these immense powers. Because of our cowardice, he quips, we've gotten the Star Trek computer, but none of the other inventions on the show. According to Teal, this has left us emasculated as well as earthbound. Here, he sounds a lot like Richard Spencer. It's significant that Teal's stand-in for the Antichrist is Greta Thunberg, the young woman who has made it her mission to warn us about anthropogenic climate change. We men, he seems to suggest, are being bested by a girl. Teal's alternative is the catacon, which he defines as a leader or nation with the strength to hold back the end of days a little longer by charting a course between Armageddon and the Antichrist. What that means is a willingness to give up the Antichrist's feminizing security and come a little closer to Armageddon by deregulating and promoting risky new technological ventures like the kind that he and his friends, like Palmer Luckey, are developing. We could keep going and detail the monarchism of Mencius Moldbug as well, but what does all of this mean? I don't think that we can expect any of the utopian visions of the far right to come to pass in even the broadest outlines they have given. The next 4 years, don't get me wrong, will be grim and brutal to be sure, but barring unforeseeable disasters, Trump will not become the lifelong CEO of America. We're not going to see a white ethno-state or imperium. We're not going to descend into civil war. And we're not going to watch as the nation state fragments into 1,000 competing corporate city-states. I think that this is the case for several reasons. We're already seeing fractures in this coalition, which is divided between the cold and warm streams of contemporary fascism. The cold stream of fascism is willing to welcome anyone into the nation who shows high performance, whether that be in psychometric tests or in techno-economic competition. The cold stream is Musk's eugenic meritocracy of exceptional individuals. It is anti-woke, but it typically includes Jews as well as skilled immigrants from Asian economic powerhouses. The cold stream tends to be Philistine in its cultural politics and prides itself in holding exclusive claims to rationality, free speech, liberty, and objectivity, all of which are used as flimsy pretexts for offending and oppressing others. The warm stream of contemporary fascism is blood and soil nationalism. It's what we usually think of when we think of fascism. In the warm stream, national belonging is contingent on native heritage or ethno-racial identity, neither of which depend upon demonstrated performance. Warm fascists are willing to make arguments about IQ when it's expedient, but they also believe in the pre-rational character of identity. And they might just as easily cite the accomplishments of cultural heroes such as Beethoven or Wagner as proof of their superiority. They are romantic in orientation, and their values include tradition, trust, community, and shared feeling, which they use as flimsy pretexts for a proposed program of ethnic cleansing through forced expulsion and genocide. A single individual might move between those two positions. We've often observed this, but conflicts arise between the two when it comes time to set policy. We saw this quite clearly with the H-1B visa controversy, which I'm happy to talk about later. Even if a single dominant ideology were to coalesce out of these disparate right-wing tendencies, it seems unlikely that it could ever become a true mass movement or governing ideology. White supremacy is as pervasive as it ever was, but most people find the ideas of the extreme far right to be weird and repellent. Moreover, large segments of the capitalist class seem to instinctively know that the overthrow of liberal democracy or the dismantling of the global economic system would be bad for business, at least in the short term. The Harris campaign had no trouble fundraising. I think we should resist the temptation to present even right-wing billionaires as more ideologically influential than they actually are. Doing so only advances their legitimacy. They may be able to sway elections on the margins, but they have not won the battle for the soul of America. However, I do think that these ideas are important for another reason. We are moving through a period of global turbulence racked by both economic and ecological collapse. As temperatures rise, we'll see more natural disasters and social instability, leading to large numbers of climate refugees and other displaced people. I think many in the ruling class are casting around for a rationalization that will make this tolerable for them. The many varieties of speculative whiteness or speculative eugenics will provide comfort to powerful people who will feel some moral qualms, perhaps, as they see the homeless population continue to expand or watch online videos of children stopped on the border while fleeing disaster. They'll be able to think back to some half-remembered blog and reassure themselves that those people who are being immiserated aren't part of the future elite. They're not going to break up the polity, but in their minds, they're going to split humanity into the elect and the damned, people who dwell in the world of tomorrow and people who are relegated to the dustbin of history, people who matter and people who don't. Some of them may use religious or patriotic idioms, but many of them will draw on the storehouse of images that they have learned from science fiction texts. While thinking about flying off into space, they're going to let the disaster happen here on Earth. For this reason, we must begin to dismantle speculative whiteness and its monstrous progeny. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jordan, for that excellent talk. I'm quite glad that you sort of, because obviously the book was published, I think in October, right? And it was written
Yeah.
quite a bit before. And obviously Trump got elected after you published the book, right? So that you didn't really have the time to reflect on sort of this new weird sort of techno coalition that Trump is sort of uncovering, right? And I'm glad that you sort of updated it for the talk because it's not really in the book at this point. Recently, a curious crack appeared in the loose coalition of post-election American right around the topic of HB1 visas. Um, between sort of techno-futurist capitalists like Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, who support visas for tech-savvy, skilled immigrant workers as part of a drive for efficiency, productivity, and growth, and between sort of more conservative ultra-nationalists who want to maintain or rescue the whiteness of the American workforce by significantly limiting immigration. So what I wonder is how does this tension between differing alt-right visions for the future of America play out within your theorization of speculative whiteness? Is there this immanent tension waiting to explode between the archeo and the futurist of your definition of archaeofuturism?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in some ways, like part of the alt-right and really any kind of far right is constantly trying to weld together different contradictory ideas through whiteness, like that they suggest that they can be both modern and archaic. They can embody a wide variety of different kinds of politics. They claim to be neither left nor right, although that's not true. And so I think that we see these tensions a lot within the ideology. Um, but we also, I think, see tensions within the coalition itself. I mean, it seems like right now we have some on the right who are interested in maximizing economic productivity as the primary goal, and therefore I do want to draw from a broader base of workers than just white men who are native born and um, of a particular culture or race or any kind of background. Um, so that on one hand, there is a kind of effort to uh, accelerate capitalism on the right. And then at the same time, there is clearly a group on the right whose goal is to shelter their constituents from the depredations of capitalism through something like a kind of Herrenvolk social democracy, a kind of like whites only welfare state, um, and to fight back against a market that's often coded as globalist or Jewish or otherwise a kind of invasive outside force that is working against white interests. Um, Obviously, as I kind of suggested, the cold and warm streams of fascism seem to like be they can coexist at some moments. The ones who want marketization, acceleration of capitalism versus the ones who want protection from these forces. Um, there's a lot of overlap and a lot of exchange of ideas. Um, but as we can see, like if these ideas are going to become influential, a choice has to be made at some point about what are the economic policies of the far right. Um, and so we're seeing these groups fall apart around the question of things like immigrant workers, and more broadly, what is the economic program of the far right?
I think it's really interesting. Like, I think the one thing, like, obviously, Trump is now like turning back on his promise to increase the tariffs, right? Like, that's pretty much a choice that's been made, right? And we're probably going to be seeing a lot of these sort of tensions playing. And I think that's actually a point of possibility for the left, right? That's where you exploit the cracks and try to find a way out of it, I guess. Which sort of leads me to my second question, but also leads it really well to the question that is asked by Daniel Luce in the chat. So I'm going to combine them. So you end your book on a brief note on hope and praxis.
Mhm.
Um, there was a really funny bit. I think it was on Gillian Rose's book, but on called Marxist Modernism. It might be on something else, but
Mhm.
there's this like trend in like critical writing, right? You talk about how terrible everything is for an entire book, and then you have this conclusion where it's just like, but we can fight it, and it's like 4 or 5 pages,
Yeah.
but like,
Yeah.
uh, but sort of in the end, in the last chapter, so you sort of call for an alternative metapolitics, sort of to combat speculative whiteness as a science fiction ideology. So although, as you note, many have written about the progressive possibilities of science fiction, in the end, we see today it couldn't really combat the insidious normalization and mainstreaming of alt-right visions of futurity. So in a way, the metapolitics of the right has made some very significant progress. And years of left-wing science fiction, left-wing politics of the future sort of couldn't stop that sort of rise. So then my question would be, what is the future for left-wing science fiction, but also for a wider left-wing geek culture, maybe? Because your book also talks about geek culture quite a bit, or
Mhm.
how the far right finds an audience in geek culture. What do you think will have to change? Which sort of, I'm going to mix that with Daniel's question, which is, thanks for the great talk. I missed the beginning, but my question is, what practical steps can we take to push back on fascist narratives and the gradual fascization of everyday life? Which I think sort of like we can combine those two questions maybe on a general sort of question of what are we doing? What should we do? What's a strategy for left-wing science fiction?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because, in some ways, I mean, a few things. One is that like it's such a big problem. The other is that sometimes I wonder is science fiction enough? We often kind of promise that science fiction will solve social problems, but obviously, in addition to the kind of ideological influence of science fiction, we need um, political action in order to mobilize against fascism. Um, but within science fiction culture, I mean, as you've suggested, there have been admirable efforts um, to eliminate the white supremacist elements of science fiction culture and to reject the fascists. And we have seen in recent years the creation of a much more vibrant and diverse and accepting science fiction culture at every level. But I mean, sometimes I wonder, like, if what we're seeing is, in some cases, and I don't want to say that this is always the case, a kind of um, recapitulation of what are often problematic narrative structures, but with a more ethnically and otherwise diverse cast. I mean, we still read science fiction novels that are about the exceptional heroic individual who is genetically predestined to be greater than anyone else. Maybe they have some friends who are also genetically predestined to be better than anybody else. Maybe they have an ancestor. Maybe they have a special gene. Or maybe they're just like in the world of the story, they're just better. um, they are the ones who change history in these stories. And often they do that through violence, through attacking the ontologically evil beings from the outside who have disrupted the harmonious system that they live in. Um, and, you know, we've gotten better about not making the heroic protagonist always white and the alien outsider always coded as non-white. But I think we need to dismantle this entire narrative structure entirely. And I think that, you know, which is not to suggest that now science fiction magazines need to like have a rule like no heroes. Our submission guidelines no longer include heroes. But I think we need to like stop a second and think like, what do we actually believe when we're writing science fiction? Because as I pointed out earlier, science fiction often allows people to say things they don't really think are true because they're in a fantasy world. So like, do we really believe when we read superhero comics that and there's a vigilante who's outside of the law, who is not restrained by anyone else, who's going to bring justice to the world by beating up bad guys? Or do we really believe, you know, I'm rewatching the film version of Lord of the Rings. Do we really believe that monarchy is fine, but there might be an evil advisor who's infected by some foreign presence that has you know, poured poison into the ears of the king and prevented him from ruling justly? Or do we really believe that like war is eternal and the future is going to be about fighting androids or bug people or something else? Like, I feel like when we write science fiction and fantasy, in addition to making sure that at the surface level, we are being progressive and inclusive, we also need to think about what is the maybe unconscious ideological message the structures of our narratives are sending. Like often it feels like people are writing a copy of a copy of a copy of a pulp science fiction book that if they picked up that book, they would reject entirely. But because it's been kind of passed down and Xerox so many times, we don't see, you know, the message of it. It becomes acceptable as a kind of narrative structure. But I would not say that writing science fiction is going to be the thing that stops the current trend towards the right. But I think that's the next step, maybe, for science fiction culture to work on, especially outside of like literary science fiction. I should also add that like we do see more interesting narratives within the kind of science fiction produced for science fiction readers in the small magazines and in science fiction exclusive presses. But still, the blockbuster narratives often feel like um, new variations on old right-wing narratives.
And that's exactly what I was thinking. Like young adult, narratives, right? I was looking at Poppy War, I think the book is called by R.F. Kuang, I think their name is. But like, yeah, special hero, they're so much different from everyone else. They get selected to a school, but they're better than everyone at the school as well. And it's just like that's how the narrative unfolds, right? And that's like maybe that's not the best premise to create a young adult audience for so many people to read. And thank you. That's great. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna open the floor for discussions and questions from the audience. So we have two questions from the chat already, but I want to see if there's anyone who wants to ask a question to Jordan directly. You can just raise your hand on the platform and not. Um, okay, I'm just gonna read the questions that Aurelian and Stevie asked, and then maybe we can see if there's anyone who wants to ask a question directly. So Aurelian's asking, could Jordan tell us more about the role of class and labor in far-right science fiction? Is there also an element of demophobia slash classism, as well as racism or misogyny, or do they simply ignore the question of class conveniently?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, in the book, I look at, people like Ayn Rand, who definitely kind of sees much of the working class as simply a tool for the elites to kind of execute their vision with. Um, yeah, I mean, it's interesting, like how much of this does erase the question of class and labor. Um, I mean, we see in some science fiction visions, like, a return to kind of handcraft, simple peasant life, this is a common theme, I think, in all fascism. Um, in other moments, I feel like technology allows them to dodge some of this stuff. I mean, I think, somebody like, um, say, like Nick Land, the right-wing blogger who very much draws on science fiction images, imagines that automation is just going to eliminate the need for labor outside of the small cadre of geeks who are able to code and therefore who gain admittance into the future. And so a lot of times I feel like science fiction images allow for an erasure of class struggle, an erasure of class and labor, and allow some of these people to imagine a future in which um, either a future of leisure, perhaps, or a future of abundance, or a future in which only a kind of specialized skilled work continues that only the greats can do, and then everyone else is kind of jettisoned because they are now outmoded. Um, yeah, and there's also just a more broader, just like contempt for crowds, contempt for the masses, contempt for large groups of people who are figured as either mediocre or as um, just sort of hungry mouths who are going to devour the wealth of the people who really create value. Often the images of zombies come up, representations of the masses as these kinds of um, mindless consumers. And here I should note that the way that class often manifests is stuff about consumption. Like there are producers on one hand and consumers on the other. And the producers are the racially or genetically or otherwise superior, and everybody else is just sort of like drawing their energies, cannibalizing them or consuming them metaphorically, or in some narratives, like literally. Like I've looked at stories in which the this goes back probably, might think all the way back to Time Machine, the Morlocks, who the fear that the working class is going to eat the rich. It runs deeply through a lot of right-wing thought.
That's quite curious because like it sounds like they simultaneously wish to create a post-scarcity work where there's no reason for producing, but they also fear that mass of people that will be produced that won't need to produce anything, but they desire to produce like that. There's this weird
Yeah, yeah,
nonsensical sort of contradiction, right? Like you want to produce no need for work, but then value and hate the fact that people are no longer working, which is like
yeah. I mean, it's weird. Like they want some kind of like they want a project, it seems like often. Like they want to colonize the stars or something like that. They want to do something and they want to build something. They're not interested in everyday life, like the reproduction of everyday life. Richard Spencer is always like speaking contemptuously of shopping malls. They kind of hate the work required just to live and survive. They hate luxury and like comfort, and but they like, they like the work of taming the stars and or the work of yeah, like cognitive work. Like they that's another thing, is this idea, and we see this like in the bell curve, for example. Like there's a cognitive elite who does the mental work and that is valorized, and then everybody else who, in actuality does the work that makes it possible for the cognitive elite to sit and think, is treated as like disposable
Hmm.
and um and racialized in a lot of ways as well.
Um, just gonna check again if there's anyone else who wants to ask a question directly to Jordan, or am I gonna keep asking questions for everyone else from the chat? Yes, Fraser. Yeah, Fraser. I'm just unmuting you, hopefully. Or yeah,
Hi there, can you hear me?
yes.
Great, brilliant. Thank you so much for the talk. I really enjoyed it. I did miss the start, so I hope I'm not asking you to go back over anything. But I mean, there's loads of questions that I would have, but I can see there's a few in the chat, so I'll try and keep myself to one. I'm interested by, so you spoke a bit about so there's, on one hand, there's this kind of techno-utopian narrative. When I say utopian, I mean from the perspective of white supremacists.
Yeah.
So it's utopia for the few, which is predicated on dystopia for the rest. Um, there's that idea, and it's kind of linked to this idea of imminent collapse at the same time. And you spoke a bit about that tension. There's this idea, often the same people, they're talking about there's going to be the downfall of Western civilization, there's going to be race war, there's going to be this and that. And it seems to me like, so I mean, there's this kind of, there's a very reactionary reading of utopianism, which is that any utopian project is always dystopian for many. I don't necessarily think that that's true, but I was wondering about that tension because it would seem that the antidote to this kind of exclusionary techno-utopianism, which is, utopia for white people only. It would seem like the antidote to that is some kind of, utopian narrative, which promises a better future for everyone. And I think one of the problems with that is that we spend so much of our time correctly talking about, climate collapse, impending climate collapse. And, I mean, this is a huge question, which, I mean, if you've got the answer to it, then that'll be great. But I was wondering how we kind of deal with how do we, talk in terms of a better future when so much of what we're also trying to do is to prepare for the fact that that is definitely not currently where we seem to be heading.
Very good.
Yeah, that's a good question, and a big one. And you're right, like there is also a right-wing version of collapse. Like I think they long for yeah, race war, civil war, societal collapse as a way of starting over, as a way of wiping the slate clean, and in particular as a kind of way of clarifying what they see as the racial contradictions. They think that once everything goes down, white people will immediately know their interests, their racial and genetic interests, and then act upon them in a violent way by exterminating non-white people. Um, but in terms of like how to, yeah, I mean it's difficult. Like I mean I've gone through various periods where I feel more utopian than others, where I kind of spend more time kind of imagining the future than others, and filling out what that means. Um, I mean, I'm not sure. Like, how do we to construct an alternative narrative that people will subscribe to, that will allow us to overcome the possibility of collapse without becoming the directors of that future is difficult. Like, we don't want to suggest that we are the ones who can see ahead. So in some ways, I wonder if part of it, and this is sort of the Frederick Jameson line, is like knowing that there is always going to be a kind of gap or a leap between our present moment and the future that we want, and that we can't fully imagine what that future is going to be, but that it's going to emerge through working together and struggling together against the capitalist system, essentially. On the other hand, though, I don't think that we should, I don't want to say that there should be a prohibition on kind of utopian dreaming of any kind, but we should always treat our utopias as provisional. And I think that would distinguish those utopias for a number of reasons from the alt-right, because the alt-right has a kind of certainty, a sense that there's a destiny, whereas I think that we should imagine utopia as something open-ended, experimental, not a program that we're going to impose on others, but as a kind of glimpse into what could happen next, a thought experiment as a way of beginning a larger conversation or dialogue about what the world should look like. So I guess the genuinely utopian idea would not be a particular slate of policies, but rather the idea that we could democratically run everything so that we could decide together what our utopia is going to be, running not only the state, but also the economy, I would add.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you so much. That idea of sort of utopia as method rather than as a destination or a blueprint. Yeah, no, completely agree. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes. So I'm gonna ask a question from the chat, and then Joshua, I will get to you. Is that okay? So Stevie Dickey asks, saying that I can't wait to buy your book ASAP, by the way. Who are some speculative fiction authors that challenge speculative whiteness? I already have some authors in mind, Octavia Butler or Ursula Le Guin. Do you have any recommendations of authors who are maybe less well known?
Let me think. I mean, I'm not sure if I have ones that are less well known, but I would definitely like add like Samuel Delany to that list, as somebody that I think not only presents a future that isn't exclusively white, but also a future that we're going to see in which we're going to see some kind of real shift from the present. Like it's not, Delaney's novels are not sort of taking the protagonist from the present and just dumping them in a better world. They're often imagining the different changes and mutations and subjectivity and ways of being that are going to occur in the future. And I think that undercuts a lot of speculative whiteness. It's very much against the idea that the future is a potential that already exists, that is just a fulfillment of current wishes, desires, and capacities, but instead a future where things that are fundamentally, people who are kind of like changed by the future, who are in new kinship relationships and new kinds of, even new bodies and new kinds of ways of inhabiting the world. So I've always loved Samuel Delany, in particular, Trouble on Triton, I feel like is the ultimate kind of anti-fascist book for me, but there are plenty of others as well.
Thank you, Jordan. Joshua, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, thank you very much. And I also really enjoyed today's talk and the discussion here afterward. And my question is really, in terms of speculative whiteness, you zoom out and talk about whether this is an issue of a dominant perspective, people who believe they're the makers and that everyone else are the takers, and would this translate, say, in Japan, it would be the same issue, right? Or so is it just a matter of a dominant subgroup that believes they're responsible for the good in the world? In the United States, these are our right wingers. And is this generalizable, do you think? And if there are specifics about whiteness that you think, leap out, that's what I think I'd love to hear about.
I mean, I think, let me think. It includes groups, a variety of different people. Some people who are dominant and part of, part of the capitalist class or influential in some way. But it also, I think, includes a lot of people who are kind of see themselves as left behind, who see themselves as prepared for the future they didn't get. And yeah, I mean, I think that part of what I'm realizing is that this is a structure that could be applied in a variety of different contexts. Anytime we see the future as the exclusive property of a racialized group of some kind, anytime we see the future as kind of emerging from a biogenetic potential of one group, I think that that could be understood within this framework. Whiteness, I think, is the classic example, and I think the most pervasive example. But I would not be surprised if there were other versions of this wherever we see either a dominant group or a group that wants to be dominant, that believes that it is the one that is going to make the future, and everybody else is existing either in an impoverished present, or in a kind of archaic past.
Man, thank you very much.
So I have a long one from Julia Estrada, but it's a really good question, so I'm very curious about your answer. They ask, going off of the neo-fascist fan you described, who takes the interest in the empire yet to be toppled in sci-fi, the idea of nostalgia and mythologizing the past does seem to still be present, even in science futurisms appealing to fascists. African speculative fiction and indigenous futurisms are rapidly expanding in audience reach, but also the breadth of their originality and expansive thinking contrasts heavily to what white fascist fandom spaces cling to through larger established IPs like Star Wars. Have you seen any recent original works gain any traction in neo-fascist audiences? It seems like even when thinking of the future, they are clinging to past hits that they reduce to the work of empire.
Yeah, I think you're right. A lot of this is kind of nostalgic and backward looking. Spencer is mainly interested in 80s movies, it seems like. I mean, not exclusively, but like, you know, he's doing interpretations of like Blade Runner or the Terminator, as well as like Frank Herbert's Dune, which is older, but the David Lynch version of Dune that he was interested in. And we see others, you know, the sad puppies and the rabid puppies were both very much backward looking when they tried to take over the Hugo Awards. One looked towards the Campbell era of science fiction, the other looked towards the pulp era of science fiction. But I mean, yeah, I mean, they're definitely interested in, but yeah, it does seem like that they're often drawn towards the major IPs, which tend to be new versions of old works. There was, I think, an attempt to, and you know, we, as with anything with the alt-right, the sincerity we should question, an attempt to like claim the Black Panther film, the first one, as a kind of alt-right text. Although this seems like it was more being provocative than being a genuine kind of fanish affiliation, maybe. And anytime, yeah, superhero stuff is any new superhero stuff, they tend to kind of grab onto. But less so, I don't know that they're all reading like the latest, you know, Kim Stanley Robinson novel or something like that and trying to adapt it to their purposes. And I think that's for a number of reasons. One is many of these people, no, not all of them, are not great readers of science fiction. They're kind of, they have their things that they like, but maybe they're not always reading expansively. But the other, maybe more important reason, I think, is that the goal of attaching themselves to the stormtroopers in Star Wars and identifying with them or something like that is to extend their audience reach. One thing that I observed was that the fascists often aren't able to put themselves on the agenda of the larger conversation happening in online spaces like Twitter. That's changed maybe a little bit, but at least before Musk's takeover, that was the case. And so what they would do was they would attack the new Ghostbusters movie or Attack, the new Star Wars movie, something that like mass audiences were really interested in as a way, or the latest video game, or getting Warhammer 40K. They would talk about Space Marines. They would use this as a way of like drawing people in and as a way of getting more people to listen to them. And so most I imagine users were not immediately going to jump over into an alt-right space, but if they see in their feed these people talking about the latest retro nostalgia, mass market blockbuster product, then I think that becomes a kind of recruiting tool essentially. Um, so yeah, I'm not sure if they are as current as other science fiction fandoms. Although I wouldn't say that they aren't reading new science fiction at all, probably.
I mean, I was thinking it's not science fiction, but obviously, Michel Houellebecq's books are quite popular with the far right, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
there's somehow like speculations on the future, right? And
Yeah, and I should add too that yeah, there's a whole, and I didn't get to this in the talk as much. There's a whole tradition of like right-wing science fiction novels rather than interpretations. I mean, the Turner Diaries is a science fiction novel, and so they do create their own science fiction, um, even though these are often kind of um, not. I mean, lots of people read the Turner Diaries, but a lot of the other kinds of science fiction, right-wing science fictions have smaller audiences. Yeah.
Mhm. Um, anyone else in the audience want to ask a direct question? No? Okay. I think I'm gonna take these next two questions, and I think we are running out of time to take more, possibly. If that's okay with you, Jordan, and everyone else. Um, so John Thompson's asking, I'm curious about how fascist self-loathing, or rather his knowledge of his own inadequacy vis-a-vis fascist aesthetic ideals, manifests in speculative fiction. Is it a means to try and escape that, or does it follow them?
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's a big part of this. These are power fantasies, and there are a couple of versions. One is that I am an overlooked mutant and a super being that people don't recognize, and someday I'm going to like show everybody up. The other I think is the fantasy of becoming this kind of robotized being without feelings and emotions, like the um and Arlie Russell Hochschild's latest book, Stolen Pride, she talks about how like Matthew Heimbach identifies with the stormtroopers, who are these, I mean, they have robot masks and armor. There's also a lot of fascists who identify with the Space Marines and 40K, Warhammer 40K, which are similarly armored beings. So I feel like that there is a kind of like compensation, a feeling of shame, a feeling of inadequacy that they try to transcend by imagining themselves as having these armored bodies that feel nothing, that have no needs. Um, in some cases, these are kind of sexless beings. Um, they want to become either a robot or a Greek statue or something that is invulnerable and unchanging and doesn't have to deal with the messy emotions that come with not only being a human, but in some of these cases, being someone who's experienced a great deal of like failure and shame and has not lived up to um, the dream that they were given in earlier in their life.
Quite reminiscent of the male fantasies book, right? Close.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of.
Yeah, right. So it's the idea of, the production of the armored body against sort of undifferentiated, slimy masses, right? That's the big sort of fascist sort of psychoanalytic narrative.
Yeah.
But also I don't remember if one of the chapters in your book was called Revenge of the Nerds or something similar, I believe. Am I correct? Something about, but obviously there's a massive sort of component
Yeah,
of like this nerd fantasy, right? Like I'm bullied and I'm vulnerable and I'm weak, but I will take revenge. The
yeah,
whole sort of psychosexual fantasy of like, the girl that rejected me back in high school is gonna come back 10 years later. I'll be a big tech CEO, and like that
yeah.
that I think we could say that the science fiction fantasies actually sort of frame these small individual narratives on a big existential scale, and planetary narratives, right? Like these masses that do not value me, they will see.
Right,
So,
exactly. Yeah. They
um,
will all be automated and useless. I'm going to,
they will all beg for my software knowledge.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it justifies the kind of, yeah, the geeky introversion and spending time on one's hobbies. Like this is preparing me for the future. I'm holding myself in abeyance for something greater. And yeah, eventually when everything goes down, whether I ascend to power or the society collapses, everyone will wish that they had been on my good side, essentially saying it.
Okay, the final question, and this is from Fraser, who already asked one, but I'm allowing because he's a cool guy. Uh, so Fraser, I can try and do this in your Scottish accent, but I think I would fail, so I'm gonna just do it. I was wondering to what extent more explicitly far-right sci-fi novels seem to have traction versus the more canonical works established IP. It's a bit similar to the question that Julie was asking, I think. You mentioned Vox Day. I'm not aware of many others writing far-right sci-fi in English who have much of an audience. I will not.
There
Usually often
is.
do the Scottish accent, but I will not. Yes.
I mean, I think that and in some ways, like this is, I think, a problem with science fiction studies. Like we tend to look at, Octavia Butler, Ursula K. Le Guin, um, but we overlook the fact that if you walk into um, any used bookstore, like that'll be there, but there's also just so much other stuff that because it's either of negligible literary value or it's really difficult to teach, like the 20 book series or something like that often kind of falls by the wayside. I mean, so historically we've seen plenty of right-wing science fiction authors like Larry Niven and Jerry Pournelle. Um, there's a lot of in the kind of the so-called golden age of science fiction of people who are pretty conservative. Um, but there's also in more recent years, like a lot of military science fiction is um, of a kind of right-wing bent. Not all of it, but a lot of visions of the world as an eternal battle um, are clearly written by authors who, for example, are willing to imagine things like resurrected Nazi soldiers fighting against an alien menace is the plot of one of these military science fiction novels. And those do seem to get some traction, not necessarily in the kind of literary science fiction world that most of us might know. Um, but there's, I think, a whole counter canon of conservative or far right science fiction that is underexplored. And because one, science fiction studies has long been trying to obtain more legitimacy, um, but also because like these aren't things you want to put on your freshman science fiction literature course syllabus. And so I feel like I would like to see more people work on that kind of material as well.
All right. I don't think there are any other questions. I'm gonna do a final little look. All right. Thank you so much, Jordan, for the talk, but also I think the discussion was really productive and quite lovely. Some great questions and great answers from you. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. Hopefully we will be doing more of these online book talks. Please make sure that you have a look at Jordan's book, follow him on his socials, as well as following us, hopefully on our socials as well, and join our network. Thanks again, everyone, and hope you have a lovely rest of your day / evening, as it's 9 p.m. in the UK.
Yeah, thank you all for your great questions, and thanks for coming out.